The TFV2 is the sequel to the ever-popular Tofu and represents the next generation of in-house design from KBDFans. The $230 price point is higher than their older offerings, but it's still easy on the wallet compared to other customs. It offers a couple features that are not seen even in higher-end customs, but as is tradition with KBDFans, they did make a serious mistake. This particular unit would be a great contender for my daily driver if there was a softer plate option, but you may not get the same experience. If this video feels a little weird, it's because I had an overall positive review written for a long time, and I was made aware of the debacle literally on the day I was going to publish. Anyway, let's get into it. I recognize that there was an integrated plate version of the Tofu, but I don't have access to that one, so I'll be comparing the design to the tray mount version. The Tofu was basically as bare bones of a design that a keyboard could get, so it follows that the TFV2 would also be super simple. The overall wedge shape from the first iteration is kept, but the corners are much rounder. I know sharp corners were a point of discussion for the last case, and getting rid of it means you won't be poking yourself on it, but it also seems less like a real-life Tofu. Externally, the seam, while pretty faint and flush, makes it clear that the case is made of top and bottom pieces. It would have been pretty cool to see a seamless version, but that probably would have driven up cost. I'm of the opinion that when a case has seams, the height of the top should roughly match the height of the bottom in the front, so this looks pretty alright to me. The slight bevel around the top edge gives it an understated minimalist look, which I think a lot of people will appreciate. The centered USB port cutout is as tight as it gets, but with a flaw. USB-C ports need to be recessed a little bit so that the cable shielding doesn't peek out. This one is flush, so no matter what cable you use, you're going to see a little bit of that metal. Hopefully they address this in the future. On the bottom are 8 small screw holes, 4 rubber bump-on slots, as well as the brass weight. This is a really thin piece that's finished in a more antique look instead of the bright gold that we saw in the 8X Mark II. I think I prefer this finish just because it's a little bit more muted. Honestly, seems to me that they could have gone without this, but they were probably catering to the crowd that's used to having weights or accents. One small comment here is that I've never been a fan of the new KBDFans logo. It always seemed like a graph to me, and my interpretation is that the intersection is some point in the future where the downtrend is KBDFans sales if they don't change the logo, while the uptrend is if they do. The design of the TFV2 is really nothing special, but the simplicity is executed well. I think the HHKB looks a little better than the WinKey top, but I like the standard for my use case. So far, the board was offered with either HHKB or ANSI. The plate seems to be compatible for both, but there are separate hotspot PCBs for each of the layouts. This means that if you got the ANSI version, you will be forced to use the 6.25U bottom row. I don't have much of an issue with this, but a lot of people prefer the 7U alternative for symmetry. It would be great to see PCB selection offered independently of the top so that people can have the option. I would also guess that there is a daughterboard compatible solderable DZ60 in the works. Getting into the construction of the board, I think you guys are going to be as impressed as I was, except there's one very serious flaw that we'll get into. The board comes apart from the aforementioned 8 screws on the bottom. These holes are really deep and narrow, so you aren't going to be able to use screwdrivers that take bits. I had to make do with a small flathead. Taking a look at the bottom piece, the most notable feature is this spot for the USB Type-C daughterboard. This connects to the main PCB, which is a DZ60 RGB ANSI model that has a special slot for the ribbon cable. The DZ60 already has a USB Type-C port in the standard 60% spot, but this daughterboard allows for centering the USB port as well as allowing some movement for more flexible plates. To accommodate the existing USB port, there is a slot for it on the upper left corner. The daughterboard is secured into the bottom case with 4 screws. Unlike any of the other daughterboard solutions I've seen, this uses a very thin ribbon cable. It is a little bit finicky to install, and I'm nervous about breaking it. They must have thought so too, because they included a replacement daughterboard and cable. Here's where the serious issue comes in. I was made aware that there are multiple versions of the DZ60 RGB PCBs floating around that have different ribbon cable connectors. These connectors have different cable orientations, so it will not work with the cable I have here. Apparently, for these PCBs, an extra ribbon cable was included that would make the connection compatible, but according to the reports, there were still 2 incompatible ribbon cables included and pre-installed out of the box. I've even seen one person say that the board let out some smoke. I'll link the Discord conversations down below. If you pick one of these up, make sure to check the PCB because there have apparently been zero communication on the issue. You cannot make a backwards incompatible change and say nothing. Getting back into the board, one good thing is that the C2C connection works. Crazy that this even needs to be said as a standout feature, but here we are. You will also notice these alignment keys on the top and bottom pieces. There's still a little bit of play, but the situation is greatly improved. This would have taken the guesswork out if it wasn't for its rotational symmetry. The top is not symmetrical across the horizontal axis, but the keys are. The plate will screw in either way, but the top will only sit on the bottom in one of the orientations when a PCB is installed. To make this more clear, I think they could have placed the keys in non-symmetrical places or made them different sizes. The plate screws into the top at 6 points. They are symmetrical, so it doesn't really seem like there was additional thought put into the mounting locations. The plate does have some interesting screw holes, which are for hot swap. Typically, if your board supports hot swap, you would want the PCB to stay in the same position relative to the plate. However, if you take out the switches, the PCB might fall to the bottom of the case, so to mitigate that, the kit comes with spacers and screws to allow you to combine the plate and the PCB into one assembly. This would allow you to swap switches without taking the board apart, but I think it could impact typing experience because it creates hotspots of stiffness in those screw locations. The TFV2 was only offered with a brass plate for me, where the effects would probably be lessened by the plate's innate hardness. Nevertheless, I don't use this because I'm alright with taking the board apart when swapping switches, and if there is an impact to the typing feel, I would like to avoid it. One last thing is that the board comes with this squishy piece of conductive material that you stick on large pads on the PCB. This is an element of shock protection. When you shock the board, you'd ideally want that to go directly to ground rather than jumping onto a PCB component. This is the only metal keyboard I own that doesn't disconnect temporarily when shocked. Overall, the construction of the board is super modern and clean. It seems to have everything from alignment pins to daughter boards. It really is a stark contrast from the days of KBD75 or KBD66. Aside from amending the USB Type-C port depth as well as making the ribbon cable feel more robust, I'm really impressed by the construction of the board not only in the KBDFans context, but in general. That was my original conclusion to the build section of this video, but KBDFans just had to drop the ball with the ribbon cable issue. You cannot be shipping incompatible configurations without any instructions or disclaimers. One argument that comes up a lot when comparing expensive versus cheap customs is the finish quality. It used to be that KBDFans cases had leftover machining lines or poorly colored surfaces, but taking this as an example, that no longer appears to be true. I know the 8X Mark II as well as the Polaris were executed well, but I would like to judge a KBDFans original design separately from those. The only external flaw I managed to find was on the brass weight, where there were a couple light scrapes. This seems to be more or less unavoidable with brass parts at this price range, so honestly, I wouldn't miss it if it was gone in a future iteration. The color match between the top and bottom pieces for the black is spot on, though I know it might be a little harder for other colors. Internally, there is a single flaw at one of the screw holes on the top piece, but of course this is not visible when assembled. Actually, even the interior of the bottom piece is finished as well as the exterior, which is oftentimes a place where they can be less strict. I know I've previously said the only thing consistent about KBDFans is inconsistency, but I'm hoping this is the new normal because it's great. Let me know down below in the comments if you've bought a KBDFans original design recently and have had worse experiences with finishes. And that used to be the conclusion to the finish section. I guess KBDFans remains inconsistent. The TFV2 was only available with a brass plate. It seems to me that the brass fad is going away, so I'm hoping they offer other options in the future. As expected from top mount brass, the bottom out feel is super solid with no vibration transfer to speak of. Preparing for the event of a softer plate, it looks like there's about 1mm of room under the PCB. I tested this by measuring the depth with and without the plate screws. I think this should be enough for flexible plates, especially because this is a smaller form factor. Other than that, there's nothing much to comment on in the typing experience. It's the usual harsh bottom out we're familiar with. I think KBDFans is missing a surprisingly large segment of the market by going with brass only. Sound is also nothing out of the ordinary for metal keyboards. It's the familiar high-pitched and dampened tone. There is a case foam that fits under the PCB with a little bit of compression. Since I'm using a brass plate, the feel is not at all impacted, but the sound is slightly dampened. I think this has a typical enough sound that it doesn't really need the foam, unlike the KBD8X Mark II. The TFV2 doesn't make strides in typing experience or sound, and I was all but ready to praise its big leap forward in construction and finish quality. But after the ribbon cable issue was brought to my attention, I have a hard time recommending the board as wholeheartedly as I would have. It seems like you will be given a path to a functional board regardless of the version of the PCB, but the fact that the problem is not documented is entirely inexcusable. KBDFans caters to a global audience, and as they get bigger, they will need to grapple with providing better support if they are to be taken seriously. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely improvements here, but with their slow rise in price, audience, and capital, we should hold them to a higher standard.